All right, as I mentioned yesterday, I will not be in class on Monday. We will not have a synchronous class on Monday in the classroom or on Zoom. And so, in place of that, I'm recording this short lecture, and then we will meet again on Wednesday of next week. So, we will not meet on Monday. There's no synchronous Zoom, and we will not meet in the classroom, but we will meet on Wednesday. So I'll see you then, and we'll continue this. But I just want to record a short lecture to cover a little bit of the basics of the foundations of the Qing dynasty, because for modern China, Shopa is going to go back to the Qing. And I think a lot of historians, when they talk about modern China, want to include the entire last dynasty of China. And we'll talk about the details of why that is. It goes all the way back to the early 1600s, the founding of the Qing officially in 1644, but the Manchu people who conquer the previous dynasty and establish the Qing dynasty do something that is, in the view of many historians, qualitatively modern. They invent a kind of ethnic identity in their conquest of China in a way that's, in the eyes of a lot of historians, modern. So this is the beginning of modern China, although we're still in the imperial realm. The choice to start at the beginning of the Qing is also interesting because it is in opposition to a lot of other historiography that starts in the 1800s, in the 19th century, not coincidentally, with the arrival of the Europeans, especially with the Opium War. This is interesting because the Chinese Communist Party also likes to use this moment as well. It fits into a certain kind of Marxist teleology that we'll talk more about when we get to the communist revolution in the 20th century. But suffice it to say, a lot of historians want to say that modern China starts with the Opium Wars in the 1840s, 1839 to 1842. And this is something that fit into the model of Cold War politics. That is, Western impact awakened China to the modern world. We're not going to do that. We're going to challenge that idea. So you have to have a sense of what the lay of the land is, and then the way in which Shopa is challenging that by going back to the beginning of that long Qing dynasty, ruled, as I noted yesterday, Wednesday in class, by the Manchus. Okay, this is a Chinese proverb, or a chengyu. And you noted, some of you noted in class that you're studying some Chinese. This is a sort of a double chengyu, or an 8-character chengyu. 水能载舟，亦能覆舟. That means the water can support the boat, but it also can tip the boat. And this is a big, sort of long scope view of government and the governed. The idea is that the people are required, some form of consent of the people is required, some form of political capital or endorsement or mandate, some kind of mandate is required for a government to stay in power. Without that, the people can always overthrow it. This is interesting, especially today in light of a lot of discussions about authoritarianism around the world. Obviously in China, but also in Russia, and in the United States as well. When we talk about authoritarianism and the differences between authoritarianism and democracy, there's a very common misconception that authoritarians are just in power doing everything that they want to do. And I think that's a sort of a blinkered or a circumscribed or a limited view of authoritarians. There is some level of support, or at least a lack of active total resistance that is in place in most authoritarian regimes. This is a troubling fact, I think, when we think about things like agency, individual agency, in a lot of these historical contexts. But it is troubling to look at this kind of history, and I think it's appropriate to be troubled by it, just as I think we're living in a very troubling moment in American history as well. So thinking about these things in the context of China is a nice way for us to take one remove from it and think about it in the abstract. Okay, I'm going to bounce through these early slides because we looked at them on Wednesday. This is a physical map of China. We're going to zoom in on those rivers, those two main rivers. So here, this is what we might call China proper. Um, and that's an informal geographical term for the eastern seaboard and several hundred, a couple thousand miles inward to the west. These two rivers, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but this river in the north is the Yellow River, sometimes called China's Sorrow. It's called the Yellow River because it silts up. It's also called China's Sorrow for that reason, because a river that silts up or picks up very, very fine sand often is going to flood as a river that rushes at its headwaters and then picks up a lot of silt. It's going to deposit that silt when it slows down, and depositing that silt raises the riverbed and causes lots of floods. So the Yellow River was nicknamed China's Sorrow because these perennial floods would cause drought downstream where there should have been water because there was flood and the water had flooded all over the plains. And this drought would cause famine. And so the Yellow River, named the Yellow River because of the color of the soil that it picked up in the lowest plains, is also known as China's Sorrow for that reason. So that's the northern river of China. That is the Chinese cradle of civilization. And you'll get this a little, very, very briefly in the Shopa book. And then down here we have the Yangtze River. The Yangtze River, also known as the Changjiang, which simply means the Long River, is in some ways a kind of Mason-Dixon line for China. It separates the north from the south. But also the Yangtze River Delta, the analogy stops there, by the way. We shouldn't force that analogy of comparison between the eastern seaboard of the United States and China. But this divides culturally northern from southern China. Many dynasties existed mainly to the north or mainly to the south of this. And I'm going to send you an infographic, a pretty neat JPEG that's easy to find on Wikipedia, that shows the changing land masses of each one of the Chinese dynasties so that you can see how striking the difference is from the early Chinese dynasties that were really just here in the Yellow River Valley, and then the later ones that expanded or contracted, and in the case of the Mongol Yuan dynasty in the 13th century, and then the Manchu Qing dynasty expanded somewhat to look a little bit like the People's Republic of China today. So the Chinese map in different dynasties looked very, very different, and I think that's an important thing for us to bear in mind. So the Changjiang or the Yangtze River here is this river that divides north and south, the Xi River down here, or the Pearl River, leading to Guangzhou, also known as Canton. We talked about this a little bit yesterday in Hong Kong here. And Shanghai, Nanjing, and Hangzhou are this Yangtze River Delta, which is the eastern end of the Yangtze River. That's a kind of cultural heartland in some ways for China. I say heartland not in the sense of, sort of Nebraska or something, but in the sense of being a kind of cultural hub of Chinese mercantile elites and also educated elites. This was really sort of where it's at. I guess you could look at something like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York in early colonial history to maybe make an analogy again there. And I'm not going to try to force these analogies too much because they're pretty hasty. We talked about the basics of the Chinese language yesterday. When you bring that together with Chinese geography, you get some pretty useful ways of seeing the map. And you see these terms, he, hu, hai, shan, and guang, as 5 different place names or geographical features, and then just your basic directionals, dong, nan, xi, bei, east, south, west, and north. When you put those together, here you see that Hebei means north of the river. So it's going to be here to the north of the Yellow River. Henan, understandably, is going to be to the south of the river. Shanxi and Shandong to the west, respectively, and east of the mountain. Mount Tai is here, and so to the west it's called west of the mountain. To the east it's called east of the mountain. And then Hubei and Hunan to the north and to the south of the lake. There used to be a very, very big lake that has been desiccated here called Dongqing Lake. And so the province to the north of it is called Hubei, north of the lake, and to the south, Hunan. You may have heard of Hunan The Hunan cuisine is very popular outside of China, so you can probably find some good Hunanese food in your neighborhood. Also, a lot of Chinese leaders, including Mao Zedong, who we're going to talk a lot about in a few weeks, was from Hunan. Very spicy food from Hunan. And Mao used to joke about that, how revolutionaries like spicy food. Guangxi and Guangdong here, the broad or expanse of the west and the broad or expanse of the east, sort of broad plain is what they're talking about here, are the name of those ones. So these 8 terms, and then Hainan. Hainan is the territory that I study. It's called to the south of the sea, or south of the sea. That's the island there. You'll see the directionals, Dong, Nan, Xi, Bei, east, south, west, and north in a lot of Chinese provincial names, even if it's not these specific ones. Okay, the Chinese dynasties here, you don't have to memorize this. I don't expect you to memorize it, but I would like you to spend a little bit of time just so that this is not an alphabet soup. The Xia, Shang, Zhou are the ancient Chinese dynasties. You can call them the Bronze Age dynasties as well. And then we move into the Iron Age, or the early imperial period, the Qin and the Han. And then there's a long period of disunity. That really should be in quotation marks. I really should have put that period of disunity in quotation marks, because it assumes that unity is the default sort of factory settings of the Chinese polity, and I don't think that is the case. So the so-called period of disunity is what I should call it. Runs about 300 years. From 220 to 588, and this is the period when Buddhism really starts to flourish in China, arriving along what we call today the Silk Roads, from India, of course, what is today India. Then the Sui, Tang, Song, and Yuan are the medieval period, the so-called medieval period. Again, these are hasty chronological distinctions. The Yuan, of course, is the Mongol Yuan dynasty. And then the Ming and Qing dynasty. And the Qing is going to be where we're going to really start our story. So on the last line here is where we're going to start our discussion of modern China. But you should have a little bit of an understanding of these dynasties, and a few of you took my 4260 class, and so I'm going to be calling on you when we talk on Wednesday to see what you remember from these discussions of the Qin and the Han, but also a little bit of the Sui and the Tang and the Song and the Yuan. We call this medieval Chinese history, but a little bit like, well, actually anywhere except for Europe, medieval does not mean the sort of dark ages. On the contrary, the Tang is one of the period of, the Tang and the Song are 2 periods of great cultural florescence, of flourishing in Chinese history. And so it's a sort of misnomer in Europe, and a sort of Eurocentric way of thinking about things to call the medieval period a dark age. And I had some colleagues who have since retired, Cheryl Riggs, who would always get her hackles up when people talked about the Dark Ages, and she would very quickly correct you if you said something about this period. There was a very convenient thing. It's a convenient aspect of the sort of teleological narrative of the European Renaissance to call the medieval period the Dark Ages. And that isn't to say that everybody was happy and everything was wonderful in the medieval period of Europe, of sort of kings and knights and vassals and that kind of thing, but it is important to remember that it's a kind of marketing ploy of the Renaissance thinkers, and then later the Enlightenment, to refer to that as the Dark Ages. It discounts a lot of intellectual flourishing that was going on in the time, including things like the Carolingian Renaissance. I'm not a European historian, but I say this just to note that chronological distinctions like this are usually more a matter of convenience than they are a really precise way of distinguishing one period from another. I'm not going to go through the ancient imperial slides here. I'm going to jump forward to a figure who hopefully whose name you've heard before, and that's Confucius. Confucius is a Latinization of Kongfuzi or Kongqiu or Kongzi, simply Master Kong, who lived from the 6th to the 5th century BCE. Before the imperial unification of China. He was not terribly successful in his own lifetime in terms of becoming a kind of prime minister. That was a sort of aim of his. He taught benevolence. He didn't strictly teach nonviolence, but his teaching of education and ritual and respect for history and poetry and literary excellence. Um, his teaching of those values, of really what made Confucianism the foundational philosophy of Chinese culture, was not considered to be terribly relevant by most of the political leaders of the time, who were busy invading each other's territories, and they chose a philosophy called legalism, another one called militarism. You may have heard of Sun Tzu, sometimes called Sun Tzu, Sun Tzu's Art of War, which is very popular with Wall Street types who sort of fancy themselves tough guys and sort of take no prisoners, kind of nonsense. They fundamentally misread that text, it goes without saying, but I think that idea of focusing on military conquest as a mode of power acquisition is in stark contrast to Confucianism. And you may be interested to know that there isn't really a word for Confucianism in Chinese. Confucianism is called Rujia, and Ru means soft or benevolent or yielding. And it was given that name in contrast to the legalists, to the militarists, and those who believed in harsh punishments and even excessive use of force to subdue a population, doing things like burning books and burying scholars, which was a famous thing that the first emperor of China, who was an adherent of the legalists, the rival philosophy of Confucianism, did execute a number of scholars who disagreed with him, and burned all books he could find except for the military and agricultural tracts. So that sort of anti-intellectualism was sort of first out of the gate, and then well after his own death, Confucius had his philosophy become the orthodoxy of this state, and that starts in the Han Dynasty. Here are a couple of those maps that I mentioned. The first dynasty of China, the Qin, which is very, very brief, and then is quickly overthrown by the Han. And I'm not sure if you can see there, but the dates of the Han are about 400 years. The Qin, ruled by the harsh legalists, is about 15 years. And in some ways, there's a kind of bitter vindication on the part of the Confucians, who said, yeah, we told you, if you rule like a legalist, your reign is going to be brief and justice will be swift. And so the Han Dynasty establishes Confucianism as its orthodox philosophy, and that's going to stay in place with some fits and starts for the next 2,000 years until our story in the Qing Dynasty. So I'm going to skip through these really fascinating histories of imperial China. I've got about 200 slides here for those who want to scroll through there and take your time. And I'm going to jump forward and introduce these guys here, the rise of the Manchus. Now the Manchus, jumping forward about 1,600 years, the Manchus are a group who ride into China from the northeast. That is sort of the head of the rooster here on the Chinese map that looks a little bit like a rooster in profile. The Manchus are not nomadic. That's an important distinction from their neighbors, the Mongols, who certainly are nomadic. The Manchus have some mobile hunting and seasonal agriculture that does have them moving, but not in the kind of seasonal way every single season as the Mongols had done. They sometimes come to military alliances with the Mongols, and they do certainly in the late 1500s and early 1600s, when the Ming Dynasty is starting to crumble and starting to fall. Interestingly, the Ming is going to fall before the Manchus successfully conquer it. This is going to be an interesting little detail, and I'll talk about that in just a second as we move toward wrapping this up. The Manchus had previously been known as the Jurchens. They had a previous dynasty. It had been called the Jin Dynasty, J-I-N, which is Chinese for gold. It also happens to be the same surname as the Korean surname Kim, the same as the North Korean sort of royal family. The Jin Dynasty of the Manchus, who are the neighbors of the Koreans, is way back in the 1300s, 1200s, 1300s, and is taken over by the Mongols. But they often have a kind of working relationship, the Jurchens and the Mongols. They're not really always in a state of constant warfare. Um, and that's very commonly the case, as is the case between the Northern Europeans and the Romans. It isn't a constant state of violent conquest or violent warfare. There are long periods of trade and perhaps uneasy peace between them. So the Jurchens become the Manchus, and the process of the Jurchens becoming the Manchus is a very deliberate one. They take the Mongol script, the Mongol written language, which the Mongols in turn, as I said yesterday, had taken from the Uyghurs, actually, what is today Xinjiang, and they adopt that and they establish their own written language, their own phonetic language. Chinese is not phonetic, it's sort of partially phonetic, but it's more ideographic. That is, an idea is represented with a character, not a sound. The Manchus have a phonetic language, which means their written language is based on sound, like ours, like all European languages. And they're going to establish this new script, and they're going to establish a kind of newly constructed ethnic identity that becomes hardened and sort of ossified around a few really important things. One is their martial or their military traditions. That is, their often their horseback military traditions. In that way, they do have some similarities in military tactics to the Mongols. Horseback archery has a special word in Manchu called niambi. That was a kind of military technology of its time. Same with the Parthians when they had fought the Romans centuries earlier. This was sort of beyond the pale, according to the Romans. You're not really allowed to do this. Your archers should all be very civilized and on the ground. But the Manchus and the Parthians have found that this was a very, very effective rule to break, and they did, and they won lots of battles as a result. So they start to ride in from the north as the Ming Dynasty, which is the last Han majority Chinese dynasty, is starting to crumble. Prior to the Ming had been the Mongol Yuan dynasty, also obviously not a Han Chinese majority dynasty. But going before that, the Song and the Tang and the Sui and the Han had indeed all been Han Chinese, ethnically Han Chinese dynasties. The issues of ethnicity and race are big ones. They're going to come up a lot in the course of our exploration of modern China here. So we'll revisit that. We'll come back to that and talk more about it. But for now, suffice it to say that the Qing dynasty is not a Han Chinese dynasty. That's very, very important. It's important because when people want to read backwards into this history and call it Chinese history, they should have some awareness of what they mean by that term. Right? So when we talk about the United States history or American history, we're saying two different things. Right? The United States history doesn't go back before the establishment of the United States. And if we say Chinese history, well, where does that go back to? Does that go back to include the Manchu and the Mongol dynasties that were established through domination of the Han Chinese people? I think that's an interesting question. And I think, again, as I said yesterday, framing the questions is often more important and more interesting than coming to a quick and an easy answer. I'm not terribly interested in quick and easy answers. They're usually wrong in these kind of historical situations. Okay, so jumping ahead here, the key aspects of what make Manchus are their establishment of very, very strong military ability, military capacity, and you can see in the image there, one guy is a little bit worse for the wear in terms of taking on that Manchu warrior, and also they're merchants. Their wealth is built often on trade. It's interesting because in addition to valuing, in the Confucian Chinese tradition, in addition to valuing education, history, literary refinement, filial piety, family structure, filial piety meaning that the devotion of a son or a child to their parents, those sort of cultural values, there also is a very, very strong negative view within the Confucian tradition of the military tradition and the merchant tradition. Um, this is very important because the Manchus are military men and they're merchants. So they're going to come in um, somewhat at a disadvantage if they're going to start calling themselves Confucians, and they are. They are going to consider themselves, after their conquest, the rightful heirs to the mandate of heaven and justifiably the inheritors of the Confucian Chinese mandate. And it's going to be a little bit of a tricky a case for them to make because they're merchants and they're military men and they're not necessarily the most sophisticated of scholars, which is the thing that is most valued within the Confucian tradition. So who are the Manchus? They come from what's called the Aising Gyoro clan. Aising means Jin, as I said, it means gold. And they are going to inherit the sort of legacy of the Jin dynasty, which is going back to the 12th and 13th century. But then they're also going to adapt it for a couple of reasons, for a couple of interesting reasons. One of which is they had to conquer the previous dynasty, and the previous dynasty was the Ming dynasty, which means bright, but it's made of the characters for sun and moon, and in Chinese cosmology that is a symbol of fire in the sort of Chinese elements, cultural elements. And Jin, meaning gold, is going to be melted by fire. So there were some within among the conquering Manchus who wanted to demonstrate a kind of cultural fluency in Chinese cosmology, and so they said we have to come up with a new dynasty name that's going to be suitable to be the conquerors of the Ming, the bright fire sign of the Ming, and they came up with Qing, which is a water sign. It means clear brightness, and it is has three water radical dots on the left-hand side. I'll show you an image of that later in class. The Manchus, the Mongols were welcomed in to alliances with the Manchus. The Manchus had a very flexible ethnic identity at that point. They're also very, very savvy in a way that I think merchant cultures often are. And this goes back to merchant cultures in many different cultural contexts. There has to be a savviness on the part of the merchants and an ability to move from one culture to the other and to do business effectively in many different cultures and respect the host culture in which you find yourself in such a way that you can do business with them, that you can trade with them and have a kind of mutual respect that often involved learning many different languages, understanding the practices of many different religions, maybe even mixing cuisines and that kind of thing. So there's a kind of hybridity to Manchu culture that makes them very savvy and very flexible as they come in. That makes them good allies of the Mongols, also of the Uyghurs farther to the west. And then also they're going to get a lot of allies among the Han Chinese in northern China. And that's going to happen pretty quickly, especially as the Ming starts to collapse. As the Ming starts to collapse, the Manchus, who are getting their act together politically and actually creating a kind of shadow government in almost a kind of mimicry of the Chinese imperial bureaucracy, many Chinese generals, Han Chinese generals, are going to look to the Manchus as a more reliable ally than the crumbling Ming dynasty. They trade in fur. Fur trade in this time all around the world was a very, very lucrative trade. In the colonies, it was very lucrative, and it also led to very complex relations between indigenous tribes and the French and the British and the Dutch. But also over here, fur is in the Qing dynasty. Fur was almost a kind of sumptuary kind of conspicuous consumption item. If you had fur, it indicated a kind of wealth and a very specific kind of fur. Of course, we all know the king's robes with that white lining that has black flecks on it, the ermine fur, or whatever other little creature they like to put on the edges of their capes as a sign of of their conspicuous consumption. And sometimes even sumptuary laws said that only certain people could wear certain colors or certain garments, certain silks, but furs were a big part of that in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And then ginseng, very, very important in traditional Chinese medicine. You'll see it in some of these crazy energy drinks at the gas station as well. So ginseng continues to be, I think, an important part of, I think, alternative medicine. Okay, so the Manchus start to organize themselves into what are going to be called banners. Banners are not only Manchu. There are social structures that surround them, and sometimes banners will include Mongols, will include Uyghurs, will include, ultimately, Han Chinese as well. And these are the 8 main banners. So the blue banner and the blue bordered banner, the white banner and the white bordered banner, and so on here. The Manchu conquest, again, I mentioned this funny idea about the Chinese cosmology and changing the name of the Jin to the Qing. Also, the first emperor of the Manchu dynasty is not called Ming-zhi, which would be the sort of traditional way of naming a traditional Chinese emperor. Ming-zhi would mean the conqueror of the Ming. So the first emperor of the Qing would perhaps appropriately be called Ming-zhi. But he's called Shun-zhi, and that's because the Shun dynasty is the name of the rebel dynasty that is established. A very brutal rebel named Li Zicheng conquers the Ming, overthrows the Ming, and establishes the Shun dynasty. So the Qing, one of their first and most savvy moves, is to come in and say, we are here to restore the greatness of the Chinese empire. We are here to restore the great legacy of Chinese cultural civilization, and we are going to throw out these vicious, wicked rebels who brought down the Ming, the previous dynasty, which wasn't so bad, and we are here to restore that greatness. And so the first emperor of the Qing dynasty is the conqueror of the Shun, the sort of vanquisher of the wicked rebels who led the last emperor of the Ming to hang himself and drove all of the Ming pretenders to the throne, literally drove them into the ocean, pushed them off the southern coast of China into the ocean. So I think that's interesting also that the Qing, one of the first things they do is they make sacrifice at the Ming imperial tombs. So the Manchus established themselves in 1644. They established the Qing dynasty. Sorry, this is the grandfather and then the father. We'll come back to these guys in class. So that the first emperor of China becomes the emperor of China the first emperor of the Qing in 1644. And one of the first things that he does is make sacrifice at the Ming imperial tombs as a way of saying, we are not here to disrupt Chinese civilization. We are here to ensure its continuity. Now, this is maybe what they had to do as Manchus here. They had to do something that said, we are not the Manchu conquerors. But in our next meeting, we'll talk about how there was a lot of disagreement between the Manchu rulers, some of whom wanted to remind the Han Chinese and remind them every single day when they woke up in the morning and looked at themselves in the mirror and saw that they had shaved their heads in a Manchu hairstyle. There were those among the Manchus who said, we're going to make sure that they know it every day, that they know that they are the subjects of the Manchu Qing dynasty. So that's what we'll talk about in our next meeting, and I will see you on Wednesday.